Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our mini seminar in our Climate Conscious NC series. My name is Peregrine Bracci. I am the Associate Program Manager for the lab at the Museum of Life and Science in Durham, North Carolina. And I'll be hosting tonight's discussion. Tonight, our panelists, who will introduce themselves in a moment, will be discussing the science and lived experience of drought here in North Carolina, which we know impacts rural and urban communities and the different people who inhabit them differently. Before we get to that discussion, I wanted to take a moment to thank our partners without whom this would not have been possible. The Ellerby Creek Watershed Association, SciStarter, Museum of Science in Boston, Durham County Sustainability Office, IC Change, the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, the Climate Change in Society program at NC State, and of course, the North Carolina State Climate Office. I also want to note that this resource was prepared by the support of Award NA18 SEC 0080008 from the Environmental Literacy Program of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, U.S. Department of Commerce. The statements, findings, conclusions, and recommendations are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of NOAA or the U.S. Department of Commerce. Climate Conscious NC is a 6-part series. Next week will be the last of our mini seminars, which bring on experts from a number of different disciplines and sectors to help us examine the lived experience of climate-related hazards here in our state. On September 10th, we will host a public forum where you'll have the opportunity to reflect on some of these hazards, your own perspectives, values, and experiences, and lend your voice to helping better understand public priorities regarding potential climate resilience and adaptation strategy and policy. Those conversations, we believe, may look similar to the model conversation that you'll hear tonight from our illustrious panel. We have a lot to consider this evening and not as much time as we'd like. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator and illustrious panel to introduce themselves.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's so nice to be with you online. My name is Kathy Dello. I'm the director of the State Climate Office at NC State University and also the state climatologist of North Carolina. And I'll be moderating the panel, asking these folks questions and keeping the conversation on track. But since we only have a limited time, I'm going to turn it over to them for introductions, and we'll start with Ryan.
Hi, I'm Ryan Boyles. I work for U.S. Geological Survey, and I study how climate impacts fish, wildlife, and ecosystems. Prior to coming over to U.S. Geological Survey, I spent about a decade as extension faculty at NC State.
Great, thank you, Ryan. Della?
Hi, I'm Della King. I work with North Carolina Cooperative Extension in Duplin County, which is a rural county in eastern North Carolina. And I primarily work with growers that grow field crops such as tobacco, corn, cotton, peanuts, just to name a few.
Great, we're so glad you're here, Vaughn.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm Vaughn Haggerty. I'm the Public Information Officer at Cape Fear Public Utility Authority. We provide water and wastewater services to about 200,000 people in New Hanover County here on the southeast coast of the state.
Great, and Dalton.
Hi, I'm Dalton Dockery. Thank you for the invite. Looking forward to the discussion. I'm the North Carolina Cooperative Extension Director in Columbus County. Been here for 26 years. My background is in horticulture. However, I've done some of all of it in terms of field crops and row crops. So looking forward to the discussion.
Great. So we have a wide range of expertise here, and I myself have worked on drought for a very long time, but drought's something that's really difficult to define or conceive. So can you talk a little bit about what drought means to you? How does it show up in the communities that you serve? I'm going to start with Dalton on this one.
Okay. Yeah, drought, obviously we know is you don't have enough moisture or enough rain to grow your crops from an agricultural background. It has a tremendous effect in Columbus County in terms of how our crops grow. Obviously, when you put the seed in the ground, you can't go dig it up later. So if you put the seed in the ground and you end up going into a drought, it affects your crops in terms of production, and therefore can affect the livelihood of the farmers in Columbus County and surrounding counties. So it's very important that we get enough adequate rain for our crops to go. The sad thing is we don't have any control over it. So it's one of those dynamics where, you know, we have to plant the seed, hope that we get enough rain for the crops. And if it doesn't, obviously it could affect the bottom line. in terms of profitability for our farmers throughout Columbus County and the state.
Yeah, so there's a lot at stake here.
Yeah.
And Vaughn, maybe you can talk a little bit about your perspective.
Sure. So from our perspective as a public water system, the biggest, most immediate effects of drought tend to result from increases in customer demand for water, particularly for irrigation. And when I speak of irrigation, I'm talking not about crops. I'm talking about, green grass and things like that. And I think it can be easy for people to not think about how much of the water they use actually goes toward keeping their lawns green. I mean, even during normal, quote unquote, times, more than 10% of the water we distribute actually goes toward irrigation during peak months, such as from April to October. And if you throw in a drought like we had last year, that can increase to 15% or more. And it's expensive for customers. I mean, I spoke with several customers last year who were surprised with their really high bills. And so we have meters that can read their usage in increments of an hour. So it's pretty fine grained. And so I would look at these customers' data and you'd see every, a particular time every day or at certain days of the week, all the time. All of a sudden you see this huge spike of thousands of gallons. And of course, that's the sprinkler system going off. And that can be a revelation to people, I think. So the other thing, of course, is demand can be a strain on the water system capacity, because there's only so much we can pull from the river or pump from the ground, only so much we can treat. Our community counts on water, not just because they're thirsty, but also for businesses, for healthcare reasons, for fire protection. It would be a real tragedy if we were unable to fight a fire because folks were keeping their grass green. So our strategy is one of constant engagement with customers, not just during the drought period, but all the time, so that we encourage behavior that builds drought resilience.
Great. And Ryan, you've worked all over North Carolina. Maybe you can share some perspective on the west side of the state.
Sure. So across the state, drought affects everyone differently. And if you think of all the different weather hazards that are out there, drought's the one that's the most insidious, right? It sneaks up on you.
Right.
A very hard time predicting it. It also affects every community differently, right? So the cities feel it very differently, especially if they have a large reservoir. As long as the water's coming out of the tap, no problem, right? Whereas as soon as you go into rural areas or you look at ecosystems that are really sensitive to what's going on in the topsoil, they see drought and experience it very differently. And so for them, the way they define drought is different than the way a city would. The way you define it in Eastern North Carolina is going to be different than the way they define it in Western North Carolina. In many cases, they rely on fractured bedrock for their water supply. It's very difficult to know, how long that water is going to last or even how deep the water is. In the eastern part of the state, there's maybe confined aquifers that you can pull water out of for groundwater supply. And you get into the Piedmont and the western part of the state, drill a well and you hit water at 50 feet, go 5 feet in any direction, you drill a well and you don't hit water until you get 150 feet. And the water pressures are completely different. The makeup of that water is different. The way we think about how we manage water and how we think about and manage drought, it really varies from community to community and even from neighborhood to neighborhood in some cases, depending on where the water comes from, how much water they need, and what they're using it for.
Yeah.
And Ryan, if I could just point to something you said, I think you're exactly right. I mean, even in some of our rural and more poor neighborhoods, drought causes a lot more stress because in more of our well-off neighborhood, they have more resources maybe to pull in water from different areas versus our poorer communities. So it does affect it differently in terms of how these individuals are affected by drought in their livelihoods. But even in the farming, I mean, it's it can be a tremendous problem for farmers.
And even with the different farming, some crops are more robust than others, right?
Yeah.
If you're running pasture and you've got livestock, 2 weeks with no rain, it can really cause a lot of problems.
You're right.
So it depends on what your needs are. And we have these things called flash droughts where all it takes is a couple of dry weeks and we can start to see real bad impacts. Whereas for other folks, if they go outside, everything looks green. It's no problem. It's just a little bit of dry weather for them.
And Ryan, the thing that comes to mind is corn. I mean, you don't get rain at the right time with corn. And nothing, I won't say discourages me, but it bothers me. When you see corn tasseling out at 3 feet high, you got a problem. It's dry. So a lot of our crops are seasonal. and it depends on getting the water at the right time. And you're right, drought can sneak up on you and you not even notice it to a certain extent. So,
and Della, I know you do work in soybeans, right? But soybeans are a different type of crop, right? They can take advantage of moisture when it comes along. They're not as sensitive as something like corn, right?
Exactly. And even from the standpoint, they make their own nitrogen source with the root system. But in speaking of drought related, I know one experience we had this summer, we had pockets within the county that went weeks, almost months without any rainfall. And that affects just little small pockets within the county itself. Just because it rains in one spot in the county doesn't mean the whole county receives any rain. And some counties, as Dalton was talking about earlier, have other resources they can utilize, like pivot systems and whatnot, to manage their water needs using sensors that they have in the ground for their crops.
Great. So I want to go back to something that Ryan said about how drought is experienced differently in rural and urban areas. So I'm sitting in downtown Raleigh. I'm sorry if you hear the train. It goes through at the most inopportune times. But what would you say to people in downtown Raleigh about why they should care about drought in rural areas? Dalton, I'll go to you.
Well, I would say, if they love to eat, they need to care about drought, specifically in our agricultural areas, because if we can't grow our crops here, it's going to be difficult to feed the nation. I know we're talking about specifically southeastern North Carolina, but I can remember I think it was 2007 to 2009 when we had an extreme drought. It cost millions. I think it was up in the billions of dollars during that particular time. And so, for people that are living in the urban areas, I think, they need to be more cognizant of our rural areas in terms of food production, and why it's so important that that when these droughts occur, that to the best of our ability, try to bring in some type of irrigation, as Della talked about. Obviously, that's not going to suffice because there's not enough. You can use irrigation, but it's not like rain coming from the sky to support some of these crops. So I think it's an awareness thing. Instead of people saying, farmers are complaining, you want to eat, you need to be aware that we need moisture. Different areas. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Della, do you want to weigh in on that too?
And I was just going to add in, it's not just that they just pull the reels or set up the hookups to have irrigation there. There's a lot of process that growers, especially produce growers, have to go through to be able to utilize that water source, because it has to be tested to make sure it's a good water source to be able to use it. So it's not as simple as just hooking everything up and just flowing water.
I actually had a question for Della and for Dalton, and this is actually based on something that Kathy brought up when she was visiting us, and that's extreme weather events. So obviously in 2008, it was really wet in part because of Florence. And then we swung into 2019 and it's pretty dry. And now we're in 2020 and it seems, for our perspective anyway, kind of wet. Is that one, I guess this is for Ryan as well, something we can continue to expect? And two, for Della and Dalton, how is that affecting agriculture?
Well, for one, we're seeing some effects now from Florence, from all the flooding that we had up in our area. And of course, those crops were done and over with. They had already drowned and they were done. They were not harvestable. They were rotting in the field. But right now we're seeing some deficits in the soils from that storm, 2 years ago. And so we're having, nutrient issues right now in some of the soils that are popping up in places.
And to add on what Della's saying, it really truly depends on the type of soils you have as well. As well as I do, where I'm at in Columbus County, we sort of have a sandy type base. So like she said, those nutrients are flowing even 2 years ago. The nutrient depletions are occurring and these crops, they're not there. The nutrients are not there enough to suffice as they would, had we not had, a lot of rain and stuff like that flowed through from our hurricane. So she's exactly right. Mm-hmm.
And that's why growers have to, put fertilizer out into the crops. So there's enough there at the root base for the crop to thrive And the moisture has a lot to do with that too. So everything kind of gets into gear and activates so the crop can take it up. Because if the moisture's not there, then the crop can't take it up anyway.
And Della too, one thing I just thought about, not only from that perspective, but think about the microorganisms that's in the water that's moving from different areas. You could easily have some disease problems depending on what type of pathogens are in that soil and how they move because of water when we have these hurricanes. So that's an added problem that the farmers have to deal with too in producing their crops. The potential increase in disease pressures from that.
Tobacco is a good crop for that because tobacco is a leaf tissue crop. Harvesting the leaf, and if it gets wind blown, beat around by rain, it's bruising that tissue, and it won't hold on long, and you'll just see it start, falling and wilting off. And it's the same thing in the soil base. There's a lot of organisms in the soil like black shank, rhizoctenia, that affect the root of a lot of crops, and if conditions are favorable for it, those spores kind of become active, and here you go. They have a feast on the crops. So that's why the growers are always having to manage these crops. And because, especially from a disease standpoint, you got to be proactive about it. You got to treat it ahead of time as a preventative. Because once it hits, it's there. Yeah. You're trying to hold it back from taking out the rest of the crop.
From the dry side, when we have the really dry conditions, it's also when we tend to have the really hot conditions. And so that you get a double whiplash, and things are getting hotter, and when it gets hotter, you need that much more rain, and not so much the volume of the rain, but you need it frequently. That's almost more of an issue, and not just for the crops that you're growing, but also for things like fire risk in the forests. Frequent rainfall is usually more valuable, but what we were seeing in the data is that when we're getting rain, it's raining more heavily, or we're having fewer days with rain.
It seems to be going from one extreme to the next, really, over the last couple of years.
Theoretically, that's what we would expect to see, and we're seeing it in the data too.
I had a farmer that said this to me one time, and I thought about when he said it. He said, we do need the rain, but we just don't need it all at one time. And that was a profound statement. He'd been farming for years, man. You're exactly right, Ryan. We need it in spurts or consistently, but we just don't need 3 inches at one time. And the same thing with drought. He related to that. He said it's okay for crops like tobacco to have a little bit of drought, but when we go extended, that's when we run into problems. So we like to have that middle ground. That's what this particular farmer was saying. Yeah.
It's like a few weeks ago when the hurricane come through Isis. We didn't have a whole lot of effect from that. We had a little bit of rain, a little bit of wind, but I think Bertie County got hit pretty hard with it. But then just that Friday after, we got hammered in Duplin County, in the northern western part of Duplin County. We got 5 inches of rain within 1 hour. It was washing roads out and flooding the interstate that goes through our county. So that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, so we started to talk about what my next question was going to be. So this is perfect. North Carolina's warming, and we're seeing these swings between wet and dry. And we've talked about how complex these systems are to manage, these crops are to grow, these utilities are to run. How are people thinking about the future in a warming climate with more of these swings from back to forth? What are the people that you work with saying to you and asking you? Vaughn, I'll go to you.
Okay. So it's for us. The thing I would point out, I think this is an issue for everybody, is that too much water is obviously a problem, but it's something generally you have options to deal with. It seems like your options are fewer when there's less water. Like when you're in need of water, there's only so many options you have, and there may not be as many as if there's too much. So for us, it's twofold. I think it's one, sort of managing demand as much as we can, and that's one, making sure that our customers understand, one, valuing the drinking water and knowing when they're irrigating or putting water on their lawn, that's drinking water you're putting on your lawn. I mean, this in some ways, I wish I could magically change it just for a little while into money so that they could see it going on their lawn, just to give them a better idea of sort of the perspective of it. But then the other thing we also have to think about is managing our system and making sure that we're able to meet demand. And that's one, increasing capacity where we can, and two, also finding efficiencies where we can.
I know one thing that some of our farmers are asking about over the years in dealing with this drought issue is they know they can't control drought, but maybe they can look at doing something with the plants, sort of like more drought tolerant plants that will help when we go through seasons or periods of drought, or more resistant type crops to certain diseases when we have hurricanes. So a lot of them are looking at it from the standpoint of how we can make these crops more adaptable in terms of producing in these extreme environments is what they're looking at. And like Della, she does a lot of research and stuff like that. And that's what we're about in NC State is research. How can we make these crops better, able to handle these severe situations? So that's what a lot of the farmers are looking at and trying to manage.
A lot of them will plant a variety. So let's say corn, they'll plant early, mid, and late season corn. And some of those varieties might be drought tolerant, some might be moisture tolerant. And so they try to get a mix so they're not completely hit 100% with 100% crop loss, which can't control the wind from storms, but you know, that's another dynamic issue they have to deal with. But that's kind of how they try to plant to have a more diverse crop system.
I think people need to understand farmers are some of the most smartest people you will ever meet. They really are in terms of managing their crops so we can all eat.
Well, and I've seen it in my career. You know, I remember driving across the state in the wintertime, you see bare fields everywhere. Now you see cover crops, and those cover crops help build organic material in the soil. It makes it stronger to resist drought. It also makes it easier to handle the heavy rains when it comes. We see a lot more prescribed fire and controlled burns in forests because that thins out the dead trees and makes them more resilient when a drought comes along. We're already seeing a lot of those actions. And then from the city communities that I've seen, they build a lot more water interconnects now. We can ship water from you know, Charlotte almost all the way to Raleigh if we have to, because we have interconnections between all the different systems. So we don't have stories anymore where you know, the small municipal communities in you know, around Concord are running out of water because they don't, you know, their little run of river intake is you know, run below the surface now. They've got a lot more capacity. They've learned from the droughts that we've had over the past 15, 20 years. But we still got to be thinking about how to prepare for the future.
Right.
And some of the struggles some of the growers have had with, you know, so we've had some interest in planting cover crops in wintertime and then planting back into it, whether it be, you know, soybeans, corn, whatever. But some of the struggles that some of the growers are having is the equipment. Planters that they already have, and you know, this is a equipment. It requires a certain setup to be able to through that cover crop to get the seed in the soil, to get the seed soil contact so it would germinate. So that's some of the struggles they're having that in when looking at trying to manage, you know, their soils. We're using cover crops and still trying to plant their regular row crops and trying to make it all work together in one system.
Della, I'll tell you, over my career, one of the biggest changes I've seen is when we went to NoTill. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but NoTill, when you just till the seed right back into the crop that's left over, that helps build organic matter in your soil and will actually help you when you go through a drought. But that change was dramatic in terms of helping the farmers industry. A lot of our farmers, at least in Columbus County, were a little bit hesitant to start with because, you know, when I was growing up, when you had to disc the field first, it had to look pretty, and then you plant it. No-till, you just drilling it right in behind. So we had to work with some of our farmers to sort of get out of that conventional mindset and turn to no-till, which helped again in terms of putting that organic matter back in the soil and moisture. So farmers are good at adapting when they need to, even in a drought.
Oh yeah, and even back to the hurricane situation with Florence. Some of their fields that were no-till, they had to go through and rip them because the compaction in the field from all the water.
Right.
So they have to deal with that as well,
Right.
with managing their crops.
So we've talked a lot about how not having enough water is a big problem. We can deal with almost too much water a little bit better than not enough in certain situations. Let's talk a little bit about water conservation. Should I be collecting my water in my shower and pouring it on my plants. What should I be doing to help out with drought? Aughn, you unmuted yourself.
Well, I could speak some to that because we spent a lot of time trying to do that. I mean, one of the things that we did this year is, so we're part of what's called the Lower Cape Fear, well, we're members of Lower Cape Fear Water and Sewer Authority that provides water from the Cape Fear River. And a part of that is adopting a common water emergency plan. And that emergency plan includes some things that would be implemented in case of an emergency, like, specific irrigation schedules and things like that. And what we've tried to do is actually go ahead and encourage our customers to go ahead and adopt that now. Why wait until there's an emergency to do these kind of things? Not only because it'll save you money and save water, but by the time it'll also put off the need for an emergency for us and make us much more able to handle it. The other thing is to take a look at your yard and see, what can you do to your yard to make it use less water or use it better? And that can include everything from, using native plants, or just the way you're landscaping right now, or even how you're watering. And then, of course, there's, installing, more efficient appliances in your home, things like that. I think one challenge, you mentioned water reuse. One challenge from a system standpoint, I think we face, I believe, I'm not super familiar with it, but I believe that there are sort of legislative hurdles that would need to be overcome to make that easier, because I think water reuse is something that North Carolina should probably look at. But I also think that I would guess that the challenges of rural communities, especially, and I believe North Carolina, many of them face in terms of population and job loss, and some of them a relatively larger share of households with lower incomes, might make it more difficult for these communities to take steps to build resistance to drought. I mean, they may have fewer resources to maintain or improve their municipal water systems, or at an individual household level, fewer resources to invest in more efficient plumbing. So I think this is a place where the state and the federal government could probably help out, whether it's through grants or low interest loans and things like that.
Well, I know from a reuse water standpoint, where we come from, there's a program through extensions like the Master Gardener program and whatnot, in the horticulture aspect. They encourage a lot of people to have like rain barrel systems and utilize that rainwater to water their garden along with, to try to conserve some water from that standpoint, and to water deep less frequently. So if you're watering your lawn, run it for a longer period of time, once a week, and cut it off and let it, so that way you're forcing the roots of the plants to go deeper to access that water.
Great.
We've seen the benefits of some of that, especially in communities in the bigger cities in the western part of the state. Communities like Greensboro, they haven't had to bring on any additional, reservoir capacity, but they've seen population growth because they've been able to keep their per capita use down. So you can grow a community through conservation. You don't have to just go out and build a new reservoir, because reservoirs are really expensive to build.
I'm getting the 2-minute warning. This has been a really fantastic conversation. We've talked about some of the challenges that producers face, some of the policy barriers, some of the communications challenges, some of the urban and rural divide, but we also heard a lot about hope. We heard about adaptation strategies, mitigation strategies. We just heard that a city was still able to grow and conserve water. So there's a lot that we can do, especially in this warming climate. But I'm going to give each panelist 30 seconds to give us, your last shot. What do you want folks who are watching tonight to take home? What do you want them to think about when drought is mentioned, or when they're talking to their neighbors about drought? Vaughn, we'll start with you.
Sure. So what I would say is, one, be aware of water and value it, because it is a valuable thing. There is no substitute for it. And it's odd that people only think about it when it's not available, but it's invaluable to us. And so use it wisely is what I would say.
Great. Dalton.
2 words come to mind: conserve and manage. Conserve water when you can, and when you have to use it, manage it like it's the last resource on earth. I think if we can do those two things, we'll be fine.
Della.
That's what I was going to say. Just be wise about your decisions you're making. And then just, I guess from a farmer perspective, if you're riding around in your community and you see these big irrigation systems running, just understand that they're running for a reason, because they need that water for that crop to be successful, so they can in turn that back to you so you can eat.
And Ryan, the final word.
I think we should all know where our water comes from. When you open up that irrigator, you open up your tap, where's it coming from? Is it coming from a reservoir? Is it coming from a stream? Is it coming from a well? How deep is that? And so, and be aware of where it comes from, because I think if we're aware of where that water comes from, we can appreciate more how we need to protect it.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate the panelists' time. Let's give them a virtual hand. And I appreciate everybody who joined us online. It would be great to see you, but I can't. So I'm going to turn it back over to Peregrine to close us out.
Yes, everyone, this has been a really, really informative conversation. Thank you to our panelists, to our moderator, and especially to our participants for this opportunity to discuss and learn. Another goal of Climate Curious NC is to move folks toward continuing the conversation and towards participating in the science that helps us better understand these climate-related hazards. To that end, these projects that will help us better understand things like drought include iSeeChange and iNaturalist. Those are some good resources. We hope that you might be able to join us next week for a conversation on the other end of the water spectrum, extreme participation. My final thought for everyone tonight is just that every voice is important in this conversation. So please, everyone, continue to have it. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.